This is awesome.
All right, great. It's so great to see so many people come out here today to fighting for justice here at
Hey Jason, where do I get the link?
Temple University, and also the struggle for the rights of prisoners and political prisoners.
Never mind, found it.
Mumia and Jamal. So this is our third installment of Dr. Montero's lecture series, Dubois and the Human Future, where we discuss the pressing problems facing poor and oppressed people, all of humanity. It's so great to see so many people come out here. Influential scholar and revolutionary W.E. Dubois. This lecture is going to be modified because we have had over the past few days a series of emergency actions to protest a new law called the Re-Victimization Relief Act, which is a fake name. That's not. It's about denying free speech rights to prisoners. And like every act of repression from the state, we know that they're striking now because we're strong. Not because they're strong, because we're strong. And the movement against mass incarceration is growing every day, as is the movement to free Mumia and Jamal. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Monteiro, who will begin our lecture. He's going to be discussing Black Reconstruction in America. Then we'll have Johanna Fernandez speak about the case with Mumia and the new law. And then we'll have an open question and answer. So thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody, and it's good to see all of y'all out here this evening in this merging of the student body from Temple University and from the University of Pennsylvania with the community. And this is very important, and I'm certain more people will be coming as we go along. As Scott said, tonight we will begin, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Joe Schwartz, who has made so much of this possible. I'd like to say thank you to Joe. We're going to start with Dubois's, if you turn your phones off, we're going to start with Dubois's Black Reconstruction this evening, but we will continue it next week. Just a few things about this work. Du Bois considered Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, his magnum opus, by which he meant his greatest work, his defining work. It is in one sense a study of the period 1865 to 1877, although he periodizes it 1860 to 1880, but the Reconstruction period technically is 1865 to 1877. It was that brief period after the Civil War where African Americans had more rights than any time before or since, even up till today. The South was where at least 90% of black folk lived. The South was also where the great battles for the rights of Africans were fought, going back to the first Africans that were brought to this country in chains, the slave rebellions and uprisings, and then in the period of Reconstruction in states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, there were black majority. And the ballot box was potentially the path to the empowering of the former enslaved Africans. We will come back to that. But it is this period that this large book is about. Now, Du Bois defines the period 1860 to 1880. So he takes it from the beginning of Lincoln's election, which in effect is the political start of the Civil War, to 1880, which was probably the real final end of any civil or voting or human rights for Africans. Dubois would say that the Africans, as a result of the overturning of Reconstruction, were pushed back towards slavery. Now, he would see this period, the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction, as a revolutionary moment in American history. And so in studying Reconstruction, Dubois is studying the paths and logics of an American revolution. Dubois's central characters in most of his historical writings are not Jefferson or Washington or even Thomas Paine. It is Nat Turner. It is Toussaint Louverture. It is John Brown, whom he wrote an interpretive biography of in 1909. He saw the source of an American revolution as emerging out of the struggles of black folk. I will return to that. As you know, in our previous lectures, I made the point that Dubois is complicated because he is speaking to several, if not many, intellectual discourses and political movements. He is at the same time speaking to Marx and the idea of the class struggle as the motive force of history, but he's also speaking to Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, and Frederick Douglass as well. Because Dubois, if he was anything, he was committed to an empirical and scientific understanding of history, and especially of American history and the paths of an American revolution. In other words, he was not a dogmatist. He was not going to take, as much as he admired Marx, he was not going to take Marxian theory and try to, as we say, metaphysically graft it on to the American situation. Now, so he's talking to this European radical theorizer, but he's also talking to Black and African history, which makes this work, Black Reconstruction, so rich and powerful, not just as a theory, but as a potential guide to understanding the paths to revolutionary change. Like Walter Smolarek said, Du Bois is huge. He is huge. Perhaps that is why he is not talked about in the American Academy that much, or as much as he should be, or in the public in general. What else could I say about that? I'm going to quote something that Cornel West said about Du Bois as he situates Du Bois and the importance of Du Bois. I think the question for us, the question for me is, and it always has been, can the American Academy and can the American intelligentsia, can American scholars deal with an African American intellectual of Du Bois's magnitude who was at the same time a revolutionary? is it possible? As you know, here at Temple, we were informed last semester that African American Studies doesn't need Dubois, quote, at this time. To which anybody with an ounce of sense asks the question, if not now, then when?
Right.
And to make such a statement, one has to ask the question, do you really know who Dubois is? Or maybe you know who Dubois is and would prefer that he be submerged in discourses about everything else but a theory of social change in the United States. And Dubois, of course, is this great theorist of social change. You know, he's always looking back to Reconstruction and its defeat. He would write in Black Reconstruction that the overturning of Reconstruction was a counter-revolution, or as he puts it, a counter-revolution of property. A counter-revolution based upon an alliance of the former plantation slave owners in the South and Northern capitalists. Now, just a small thing, I don't want to forget this either. You know, he does things that are so unbelievable. You know, I had always thought that after the defeat of Reconstruction, the new class of white capitalist farmers were the remnants of the old slave-owning class. You know, most people would think that. What Du Bois argues, and perhaps this helps us explain even what went on yesterday in the signing of this bill. Du Bois's argument is that the new class, which arose to become the ruling class in the South, arose. Wait, I'm going to stop. Go ahead. Come on, let me let you do that. Just one second. Okay. It's my man. Arose, the new class that ruled the South arose from the poor whites. The new class that became the ruling class of the South arose from the poor whites. The significance of this is huge in the ways that we understand American history and American reaction. Nativism, conservatism, backwardness. He has a chapter entitled The Transubstantiation of a Poor White. Now, he was talking about Andrew Johnson, the vice president in Lincoln's second term, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated, from Tennessee, a border state, nonetheless a slave-owning state. Lincoln brought Johnson onto the ticket to guarantee his re-election because they needed to carry a certain number of these border states like Maryland, Tennessee, and so on. But Du Bois uses this concept, transubstantiation. Now, if you're a Catholic, you know something about that word, transubstantiation. It has to do, I think, with Christ and his being coming back, or transubstantiation, the body being reborn. Dubois uses it, the transubstantiation of a poor white. Here's what he meant. Always, in the framework of the American social system and the American economic system, exists the possibility of the poor white transcending his or her class position and joining either what we sometimes today call the grand middle class, or in fact the ruling class itself. We have examples of this in recent history. Bill Clinton is a transubstantiated poor white. Lyndon Johnson, a transubstantiated poor white. But it always exists, this possibility of transcending your class based upon your race and becoming a part of the ruling class or the elite itself. For Du Bois, this carries huge significance, because unlike what Marx theorized, class and classes would be pretty much fixed and established. And therefore, the history of Europe, Marx universalized it, but he was looking at Europe, would be the history of the conflict between classes. What Du Bois saw is that on the basis of race, the poor white, the working class white, often had the possibility of transcending class on the basis of race. So it's often asked, well, was Du Bois a race theorist? Was he a class theorist? How did he theorize class with race? Would he agree with most radical theorists, including Marxist theorists, who say that the economy and economic class and the class conflict is primary and strategic? Or was he coming up with something completely new? I would suggest he was coming up with something completely new. The path to the transformation of American society, a question that is confronting us ever more powerfully in these days. Everybody acknowledges we cannot continue along the path that we are on at this time. Noam Chomsky, one of the great public intellectuals of our time, has written an essay recently, very pessimistically, where he in essence argued that we had reached the end of history. That the human species was on the cusp of destroying itself and most of life on this planet. The two things that he was looking at were global warming and the possibilities of nuclear war. Now, I don't agree with Chomsky. I think there are ways out, but nonetheless, he, like other public intellectuals, the great Indian public intellectual Antharati Roy and others, are drawing attention of all of us to the fact that either humanity will end capitalism or capitalism will end humanity. There's not a whole lot of room for maneuvering at this point. Dubois, the end of his life, in a statement about joining the Communist Party, he said that capitalism as a system is unsustainable, that ultimately it will destroy humanity. This is where we are today. You know, and it's heartening to see so much in our culture to distract all of us, young and old, from thinking about these difficult life and death questions. But the question for you is not to talk about social change, but to come up with theories and explanations that could possibly show. In the United States, and now globally, because the United States is an empire, the U.S. model of capitalism and the U.S. social system model has in one or another way been adopted by most of the world. Which means that most of the world, at least at the level of elite cultures and ideas, adopted the system. No matter where you go in the world, you will run into one or another form of anti-black racism. But Du Bois, in thinking about the United States and its history, said that it was impossible to theorize only class and class conflict. As important as class is, it is conditioned by race. Let me put that another way. You know, in social science, especially sociological theorizing, we talk about conditionalities. What are the conditions of class in the United States? How does class manifest itself in the United States? Well, is it like Marx and his colleagues theorized? Would the working class, as a consequence of its exploitation, come to consciousness about its position and therefore to a recognition that it had to overturn the old system and create something new? Would it occur like that? That's quite simple and direct. And certainly, I'm one who wished that it was that easy. But every time we engage the system of oppression and the systems of power, we see a phalanx of people that you would think would be on your side who are on the opposite side. We saw it only yesterday. It is obvious that Corbett and his Republican friends in the state legislature put this bill forward as a cheap political gimmick, and he's still not going to win. But it's a cheap gimmick. He tears up the Constitution right in front of our faces. You know, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. In other countries, they call them the rights of man. They are inalienable from a legal standpoint. Without those Bill of Rights, the Constitution was not worth the paper it was written on. the Bill of Rights extended to ordinary people, of course not Africans, certain protections of law, but with the promise that ultimately through struggle it would apply universally. And the First Amendment is freedom of speech. That's not just a promise, it is a protection of the right to speak. Now you see, we're coming here today and they got all of these little police officers outside trying to look tough. What are they doing? It's an attempt to intimidate speech. John is here, Gabe, and Ramona will be here. People who have fought for the right to speak and have fought for Mumia over 30-some years. If you take the First Amendment away, I would argue you don't have the 14th Amendment. Because central to citizenship, I think the fundamental legal basis of citizenship is speech and thought. You take that away, then we're into an authoritarian system, a regime of terror. Without the 14th Amendment, although it was never implemented until the Civil Rights Movement, you don't have the Civil Rights Movement. Without the Civil Rights Movement, you have an all-white police force. Now, it's bad enough, even with black people and women and Latinos and all of that on it. But without that, without the 14th Amendment, without the Civil Rights Movement, you have what we had under Rizzo and those that preceded it. An instrument of state terror. And I'm not saying it's not that now, but I can tell you this. I noticed yesterday, and I would ask you, do your own observations. Yesterday, I was speaking, and I was looking, because I was trying to speak not only to those of us who are the choir, but I was trying to speak to those on the other side of that yellow line. And I was trying to say to them that, you all have more in common with us than the people that you're supposed to be protecting on the stage. But to the African Americans and to the women of all colors, without the Civil Rights Movement and without protests, you wouldn't have these jobs. You wouldn't be on the police force. And if you want to understand the Civil Rights Movement, and you didn't live through it, well, what you're looking at now in the Pan Africas, the Joannas, and others, Betsy and Joe and Ramona, Kamal, what you see in us is the Civil Rights Movement. And so I tried to make an appeal to them, and I think, knowing African Americans as I do, and the souls of black folk, that there's no black person in this country who's not touched by Ferguson and Mike Brown, who was not touched by Eric Garner. And of course, as we stood there, we observed our white or their white counterparts. There was one in particular, and I thought that he was a Temple cop because he's at all the demonstrations we've had here. Come to find out, he's a Philadelphia police cop with strong thuggish tendencies. And the reason I know they're thuggish because he was trying to grit on me. like he was gonna stare me down. I said, money, please. But my point was to say to the police and to say to everyone, the color line determines where you're going to ultimately be in most things that go on in society. And if that white cop is trying to stare Ramona or Pam or myself down, don't think that he's your friend. He doesn't give a damn about you. Now, this is what Dubois understood. That the color line asserts itself throughout American society and is, as a French sociologist said, over-determining. It not just determines other things in the social system, it over-determines them. So if you want to understand class in the United States, it's not enough to talk about the working class. You have to understand race and how it determines class behavior, class consciousness, class identities. You know, and we'll talk about this more next week. You know, when Marx talked about the logic of history, he always saw the contending forces in twos, the working class and the capitalist class, the feudal lords and the peasants, the slave and the slave owner. Well, he gets it from Hegel, and there's a long history of logics being understood in twos. Du Bois introduces something new, a dialectic in threes, what I like to call dialectics through triangles, a very complicated system of the movement of history. And therefore, when Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction, the first chapter is the Black Worker. Perhaps that's why it's not read, or you can't find it in most bookstores. The Black Worker. And he says of the Black Worker, because Du Bois is this literary figure, he is imaginative. He says of the Black Worker, he says the slave, who he had already identified as a working class and as a proletariat. He says the slave was everything African. So what we today call Black Americans, African Americans, colored Americans, Negro Americans, all of those names, I'm not offended by any name. But what Du Bois was saying is that the African American people are everything African. Combining Africans from most parts of Africa. There is Arab blood. There is the blood of all of the ethnic groups of West Africa. But then from Central Africa, and the Congo, from the Sudan. So when you look at Black people, people say, well, this mix, this kaleidoscope of phenotypes and colors, where does all this come from? It must be very complicated for people who are not African American. So why is she brown and the other person chocolate? Is it because of white blood, or is it because of the mixtures that took place in the transatlantic movement and in the plantations of the Caribbean and South America and North America? This mixture of Africa, this everything Africa. And I am of the opinion that if you want to understand the souls of Black folk, well, first of all, you got to listen to Black folk. You got to hear Black people. But if you want to understand black folk, you have to understand that we have within our people everything that is African. We are everything African. You know, there's a big thing. Let's trace our genealogies back. And I think most of that is a fraud, by the way. But we are genealogically everything African. Now, just another thing. But then we are mixed with European and Native American blood. But then we are a single people. Everything African. What makes us black and not something else? You know, you have a lot of people say, well, I'm not black. I'm American. Well, that's cool. But what makes a person black and not white? And not Mexican? And not anything else? Well, what Du Bois argued, it's very simple. The blood of Africa and a legacy and history of enslavement. That is what an African is. But the first chapter is the black worker. The second chapter is the white worker. The third chapter is the planter. Okay? I'm going to be finishing in 15 minutes because I want to get started with it. And what does that set up? Now, if it were a Marxist analysis, it would have been the working class and the capitalists. But Du Bois sets it up as threes. A triad, not a binary. So the struggle for social transformation in the United States, and this is something that unfortunately has been the most difficult thing for many people to understand. We will not get from where we are to where we want to be unless we successfully surmount the fight against white supremacy, and in particular, the fight against anti-black racism. I'm going to end on this. Du Bois early on, starting with the Philadelphia Negro, his first great sociological, empirical, ethnographic study, theorized a social system. Now, much of radical theorizing starts with the economic system. You want to understand social relations, understand economic relationships. Du Bois starts and never abandons the concept of a social system within which the economic system exists. What is the significance of this? I think the importance of it is that what we wish to understand in terms of race and institutional and structural racism cannot be understood by reducing all of the matters of race and racial oppression to the nature of the political economy. What Du Bois was looking at, and what I will call, is a racialized or a white supremacist social system which informs the nature and trajectory of the economic system. You know, well, that's true. And a system that requires a black-white binary, not meaning that the only categories of race or ethnicity are black and white, but you need the black-white binary to explain all of the others. Because you need a white identity in order to justify white privilege. And hence we're dealing with a social system that operates to privilege whites or to promise whites, as long as you are white, you got a way out of this. And hence, you say, as we said before, you ask a white person. White people ask another white person. Black person asks a white person. You're white. Yes, I'm white. Well, what makes you white? Well, my parents were white. Or my skin is white. Well, I don't think so. What is white? As it is constructed in the American social system, whiteness is the negation of blackness. It's a complete social invention, nothing wrong with that. It is not biological, it's not natural, it was not inevitable that, quote, white people would identify themselves as white. Most people in the world who are today identified as white were not identified as white 80 years ago. There was no sense of a global common whiteness as we have today. Don't think it was always like this. There were Germans, there were Russians, there were Poles, there were, name them. Well, they still exist, but a weaker identity. But what is predominant and determining is this global common whiteness. Go to Australia, I'm white. Go to France, I'm white. Germany, I'm white. The global common whiteness has been the white world's answer to the conflicts that gave rise to the two world wars in Europe. The global common whiteness is the answer to class conflict. You said, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, but I'm white. What chains are you talking about? So I'm saying, a logic based upon the assumption of whiteness and an identity of whiteness, which is the most important thing in any white person's life. The most important thing, more important than your passport, your birth certificate, or anything else, is a white identity. That if I get on the plane and I'm a white person and leave from Philadelphia and go to Australia or New Zealand or anywhere else, Russia, Moscow, anywhere else, the world doesn't need to know anything else about me. And I don't have to know anything about anybody else in the world but that I'm a white person. This is not merely individual behavior. I would argue this represents a system that privileges white identity and the recognition of being white. So, we can expect that there will be people who 50 years ago would be identified as black, based upon the one-drop rule. By the way, just as a parenthesis, the only people for whom there's a one-drop rule are Africans. There's no one-drop rule for Mexicans, Native Americans. The one-drop rule only applies to Africans. Now, if you are an Afro-Puerto Rican or an Afro-Peruvian, then the one-drop rule applies to you. But there is no thing of the one-drop rule. I got the one drop of white blood, one drop of Mexican blood, and I'm a whole lot of white blood, and that therefore makes me whatever. The one-drop rule, and of course it is a social invention. Everybody's blood is the same, by the way. One drop means that going back 4 generations.
even if you look like Lena Horne, if you look like Halle Berry or Mariah Carey, if someone from your distant past can come and say, "Oh, I'm your great-grandmother," then you black. Get in the back of the bus. Only for black folk. Which supports my point that the binary is fundamental to the social system. But the social system is designed to privilege white people over the rest of humanity. The economic system, which operates on its own laws and regularities, is not separated from the social system. But the economic system does not explain the social system, its values, its institutions, and the beliefs that are fundamental to it. You know, we're often talking about this. What is the transition? Obviously, anybody that has an ounce of sense is a socialist. Anybody. Now they can, fire people for being a socialist or whatever. You can't come in here. But I mean, anybody with that much sense is a socialist. Everybody knows capitalism is not working, especially in this globalized, financialized system. It's not working. The question is not what my beliefs are. The question is how I get from here to there. The great experiments in transition from the existing system of white supremacy to a system of racial, social, and economic and gender equality have been in the black movement. It's the black movement. I'm going to end on this. Huey P. Newton. And I'm basing what I'm going to say very much on Yvonne King's reading Huey P. Newton's great memoir called Revolutionary Suicide. In 1967, Huey P. Newton was arrested for killing. He was stopped. He was driving to a party or from a party, celebrating the fact that he was finally off probation. He was stopped by the police. What went on, we do not know all the details, but a cop ends up dead, Huey shot. Huey is charged with capital murder, which carries with it the penalty of death. Huey would be put in solitary confinement. As you know, Huey Newton is one of the founders, co-founders of the Black Panther Party. And I don't guess I have to say to you all that the Black Panther Party is one of the great revolutionary formations in the history of the United States. There is no question about it. In spite of the fact that the media and politicians have attempted to criminalize it, as it has every movement of black protest and social change. That's why Mumia is in jail. Not because he killed Faulkner. I want to say to his wife, to Maureen Faulkner, stop allowing yourself and the memory of your husband, who you say you love, to be used for these cheap political purposes. So Mumia is criminalized. The Panthers are criminalized. King was criminalized. Dubois was criminalized. Everybody is criminalized who is black and who stands up. That's the way the game is played. So the Panthers were criminalized out of the gate, although their practice and their program was not the gun, but the Constitution. You have no right to pull me over without reading my rights to me. But that was a threat. Black people knowing their rights. Black people demanding protection under the law. It clashes with the underlying values of the white supremacist social system. So Huey is arrested. He's put in solitary confinement. When he comes to trial, he says to the Black Panther Party, I don't expect to be found not guilty. I expect to be found guilty and to be sentenced to death. I accept that. But let us use this trial to educate the people and to build the party. The most unusual and courageous defense that I am aware of. Huey was so bold. You know, it's unusual for a defendant in a capital case to take the stand. Huey took the stand. He was examined by the defense attorney, of course, flying colors. Then the prosecution. I got you now, Huey. Huey turned his back to the DA. And while answering the questions, would not look at the DA. A symbolic act of a revolutionary. Educate the masses and build the party. My life is not the most important thing in all of this. Now, I was in the movement to free Angela Davis more than the movement to free Huey. Very different. The movement to free Angela Davis, and I'm not saying better or worse, was a movement to save Angela Davis's life. Both, of course, struck blows against a racist legal system and a racist social system. But in the case of Huey Newton, it was a full-throated revolutionary defense and a defense of the right to revolution. We speak, and this is Dubois, of the centrality of the struggle for black liberation. Others have talked about the struggle for black liberation as the Achilles heel of U.S. imperialism. That's not hard to understand. Ferguson rises up. The world focuses on Ferguson. A week and a half, the leading story on the BBC. Russian television. Why? An instinctive understanding that if the social system is to be fundamentally challenged, and hence a fundamental challenge to all of the mechanisms of the social system, including the political economy, it will be centered in the African American struggle. Therefore, we should not for a moment be surprised that this movement of the African American people has produced a Mumia Jamal. When I went to see him last year, I told the story. Because you know, we're from the same neighborhood. And I told Pam, I don't think Mumia is going to recognize me. It's been so long. Oh, yes, he is. He's going to recognize you, Tommy. And he did recognize me. We got up there and we talked just like we hadn't been apart for a week. using our basic ebonics and street language. I don't want to use that language right now. But I asked him, I said, Mumia, how were you able to survive 30 years in solitary confinement? He answered very simple. He said, because I knew I was loved. Yeah. I knew I was loved. Anywhere you go in Black life, one of the overarching principles, the principle of love. John Coltrane, North Philadelphia, writes a great musical suite. What is it called? A Love Supreme. Nothing in American musical history like it. Stevie Wonder, Notes in the Keys of Life about love. Cornel West. Justice is what love looks like in public. It's always back to that conditionality of love. King, the beloved community is the goal of our struggle, not just civil rights. If we understand Black folk, we will come closer to understanding how we will change the horrible situation that all of us are in to what we want it to be. So with that, I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to turn the floor over to my dear friend and comrade in arms, Joanna Fernandez. Okay, Joanna. Next week, we're going to go more in depth into Black Reconstruction and what I want to show, because he restudies Marx to write it, but he does not become a Marxist. He remains Dubois. So we'll do that next week. Peace.
Peace.
Hotel.
Hotel.
Free Mumia.
Free Mumia.
My name is Brother Gabriel Barney. I work for the campaign to bring Mumia home. And I'll be super brief so I can bring my sister Johanna up. But I just wanted to say briefly, there's an African proverb that says that life is war and family is army. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that we're in a very serious movement right now for change. I was asked yesterday at our press conference by a couple of the journalists, what inspires you to do this work? And I told the gentleman, I said, because we're going to bring him home in my lifetime. We're going to do it, right? Are we going to do it? And more importantly, this is not only about our dear brother here, Mumia Jamal, but ultimately it's about Sundiata Kohli, it's about Iman Jamil Al-Amin, it's about Oscar Lopez, it's about Leonard Peltier, it's about Lorenzo Cass Johnson, it's about so many. Free them all, as we say, right? And ultimately, it's about the many brothers and sisters every day in America who are behind enemy lines and behind the walls, who are writing every day, and who are going to be assaulted, not only their First Amendment rights, but ultimately their human rights. I'm going to bring up Johanna Fernandez to break down some of the ramifications of what's called the Revictimization and Relief Act. Google it on your own. There's been a lot of resources about it. But ultimately, know that there's a campaign, a group of forces, and close forces that are fighting against it, and will not take the signing of yesterday as the last resort. We know that we're going to take it to the head and go from there. So with that, I bring in my dear sister, Johanna Fernandez.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Tony Monteiro, my colleague and comrade, for opening up this class to us. This is a historic moment. It's certainly a historic moment for the university, because this is probably the only example in the United States in which a college professor who's been fired for standing up and for amplifying the Black radical tradition in American history is invited back to Temple University by his students, and then he turns around and opens his classroom up, which is already weakened, is already on the line, to one of the most controversial figures in the history of Philadelphia. And that truly is an act of self-sacrifice. And I think it's a sign of commitment. It's a sign of love, and it stands in the Black radical tradition. So I must take on, because this is a classroom, some of the words and lessons that you brought to us this evening, and really connect it to the significance of this moment and Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia Abu-Jamal stands in what Cornel West calls the Black prophetic tradition. He stands in the Black radical tradition. Now what exactly does that mean? There are people in American history, or in the history of the Americas, like Prince Hall, who brought a petition to the emerging republic about the rights of slaves and the rights of Black people during the early period of the birth of this nation. There are people like David Walker, who wrote David Walker's Appeal, who essentially argued that slaves must defend themselves and turn their guns against their slave masters. There are people like Frederick Douglass, like Ida Wells Barnett, like W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm talking about Black people who had carried a particular tradition that has gotten us where we are today. These people are important to American history and to the history of the world because they understood that at the core of modern history was the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. That the transatlantic slave trade defined the experience of the modern world. That it financed the European colonial project, and that it brought capitalism to maturity. What exactly? The trafficking of over 10 million people from Africa to the Americas. And that experience transformed the world and has had consequences that we can't begin to understand. And if we are going to understand the Black experience, not just in the United States, but in the Americas, because the majority of African slaves did not land in the United States, but they landed in all of Latin America. We have to understand the experience of slavery. Now, people who stand in this tradition, the Black radical tradition, the Black prophetic tradition, are interested in addressing social problems and understanding its roots. And part of what they tell us is that we can't tinker with the system. The system was a system of terror. It was a system without humanity. And later, with the birth of capitalism, it was a system driven by profit and not by human need. So this system really has got to go. And at the center of the struggle for freedom is the struggle for the freedom of Black people on which the edifice of the modern world was erected. That's the essence, really, of what Du Bois brings to us in his incredible body of work. That is a very dangerous voice, a voice that has historically been persecuted in this country. It is the voice of Malcolm X. It is the voice of Martin Luther King. It is the voice of Nat Turner. It is the voice of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a political prisoner on the run. There was a bounty on her head. We celebrate her today, but she was persecuted. It is the voice of Assata Shakur. It is the voice of Huey P. Newton. These are people who have a structural critique of the system of capitalism, slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy. And they argue, again, that the system has got to go, which is why they are imprisoned, maligned, persecuted, and ultimately harassed and repressed by the state because their voices are too dangerous. Now, these voices are not vindictive. All of them, in their totality, they speak to the issue of love and international solidarity. They could be vindictive, but they speak the voice of solidarity and love across the world. That's a very dangerous proposition for those in power, and that's why they must be silenced. Which brings me to tonight's word. The bill that was just signed in this city, which is the city where the debates, the constitutional debates happened, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was the place that produced the most radical laws concerning freedom of speech. In the United States, all its component parts, all of its states have their own constitution. And Pennsylvania has one of those most radical positions on freedom of speech. And it does so because at the birth of the nation, people at the bottom of society, white indentured servants, formerly enslaved Black people, women, came onto the streets and had their own debates in public about expanding the definition of freedom, which was very narrowly construed by the signers of the Constitution, and ultimately their sense of freedom was tied to land and property ownership. But those other voices were clamoring for a more expansive American democracy, and they made their point, and they had to be heard, which is why here in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, there is a much more radical understanding of freedom of speech, and that was a premise that was killed yesterday when Governor Corbett at 13th and Locust, the place where Officer Faulkner was killed and Mumia was shot, beaten up by the cops, and called a nigger. That's where that happened. They essentially used that place, and they weren't trying to hide it, which is what's outrageous about this situation. So what is this bill? What does it say? The bill essentially says that if prisoners speak in a manner that produces mental anguish to the victims' families, they can be brought to court, an injunction presented against them, and they can be sued monetarily. But it's not just about prisoners. The law proposes to sue those who amplify the voices of prisoners. Everybody in this room is amplifying the voice of justice, the voice of those who are behind the wall, and who are sequestered, who are at a remove from American society. Now, how did this all start? On October 5th, Sunday, October 5th, as you probably know, Mumia Abu-Jamal was invited to give a commencement address at Goddard College. Mumia graduated from Goddard College in 1996. He finished his BA while he was on death row and facing execution. Part of what he writes in that commencement address is that the opportunity to get an education at that most vulnerable time in his life, when he felt most human because his mortality was before him and execution at the hands of the state was upon him, he was able to live, and he was able to travel to Algeria and to Latin America because he was studying Frantz Fanon and he was studying liberation theology. And he talked about how that was so important. Interestingly enough, at the time that Mumia was getting an education at Goddard College while he was on death row, the crime bill had been passed by Bill Clinton, which essentially eliminated educational programs for prisoners throughout the country. Okay, so Mumia gives his address. The police go crazy. The Fraternal Order of Police threatens Goddard College. It calls up the Vermont police force, and there are problems because Goddard College is under attack. It's being threatened. There are bombs that are going to explode because Mumia is going to give the speech, and the Vermont police, who are in cahoots with the Philadelphia police, are like, I can't touch this. They kicked and they screamed. They went on Fox News. They wrote letters. They had press conferences, and Mumia was able to speak. Goddard College stood its ground.
That's right.
And it allowed his alumnus to speak. The next day, he gave his speech on October 5th. On October 6th, this law was introduced into the Pennsylvania legislature, and it was fast-tracked. This happened on October 6th. On October 15th, the House voted unanimously to pass the bill. The bill silences Mumia, silences prisoners, and all of those who amplify the speech of prisoners. On October 16th, the Pennsylvania Senate voted 36-11 in favor of the law. And yesterday, on October 21st, the governor signed the law here in Philadelphia at 13th and Locust. It's essentially the Mumia silencing law. But these people are so, they're so outrageous, so corrupt, so opportunist, so without ethics and morals. These are the people who rule over us. That they, in order to silence Mumia, they're willing to deploy collective punishment to all prisoners. And they're transparent about it. But yesterday, you might have heard that we rained on their parade.
That's right.
Approximately 40 of us showed up. Strong. And we drowned them out.
That's right.
According to someone, a media outlet that will remain nameless, the media that was standing in front of the stage where Corbett was speaking couldn't hear what they were speaking because we chanted from beginning to end. Now, why is this important, and why are we here today? This is important because, as someone mentioned at the start of the program, we're winning. We're on a move. We're fighting from Ferguson to Palestine to Philadelphia to New York to the prisoners' flights that have been happening across the country. People in the United States and around the world, in Greece, are beginning to see what time it is. So they are sharpening their tools of repression in order to weaken our struggle. And this legislation is part of a broader a palette of legislations that have been passed recently. We can't think of this in isolation. There was the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which essentially gave corporations the rights of people. There is the NSA, the mass surveillance that we see across the country. There are attacks against immigrants, right? Now immigrants and women are the fastest growing groups in the prison system. There were all the laws, the Patriot Act that was passed immediately after 9/11. And this legislation is one of a number of pieces of legislation in this period when people are increasingly understanding that there are them and they are the few and there are us and we are the many.
Okay.
So this particular legislation is nothing less than an attempt to sever Mumia's voice from the movement and the people, both nationally and internationally, that saved his life. Mumia was supposed to have been executed twice in the 1990s, and he's with us now.
That's right.
That is a huge victory. And they're angry that they weren't able to execute him, so now they want to silence him. But they want to silence him because of the power of his message, because he connects Ferguson to Palestine, to capitalism, to the environment, and he says that they are the few and we are the many, and if we get our act together and we strategize and we see the monster in front of us, we can win.
Yes.
That's why they are trying to silence him. He has always been the voice of the voiceless, and he does not speak for himself. He stands on the tradition of justice. He stands on the black radical tradition, and he stands for solidarity. This law is an attack on the emerging movement against mass incarceration, which is now an integral part of American public debate and discussion. The New York Times this summer wrote an editorial titled "End Mass Incarceration Now."
Okay.
Without the voices of prisoners, without their testimonies, without testimonies about the experience of solitary confinement, without the testimonies about how people are railroaded into courts, over-sentenced, and framed by the courts. How? The fact that judges, prosecutors, and cops work hand in hand. Without those voices, we wouldn't have a movement against mass incarceration, and we would not have a movement that's winning to free political prisoners. Because we've won a lot of, we've freed quite a number of political prisoners in the recent past, and this is an attack not just on the prisoners, it's an attack on the movements on the outside that amplify these voices. It's also tragic because we live in a society that is obsessed with imprisonment. We imprison more people than China. We don't do anything more than China.
but we imprison more people than China. And we've done it through the criminalization of black people, which affects all of us, because all of us who are black or kind of look black can be shot in the street, because to be black is to be dispensable, to not be human, and to be a criminal. That's how they've gotten away with this, through black dehumanization and criminalization. So this is really a struggle that really affects all of us. And as Tony Monteiro said yesterday, you know, there's the story of how they came after the communists, but I didn't stand up because I wasn't a communist. At noon, they came for the socialists, and I didn't stand up for the socialists because I wasn't a socialist. At 3 o'clock, they came for the labor activists and unionists, but I didn't stand up because I wasn't a worker. I wasn't in a union. At 6 o'clock, they came for Mumia and prisoners. And I didn't stand up because I wasn't a prisoner, and I didn't understand who Mumia was. And at midnight, they came for me, and there was really no one left to defend me. Right. So I went down like the Titanic. Right. And part of what we were left with yesterday is we must act now before it's too late.
That's right.
But we should not take this turn of events as a sign that we are doomed to defeat. Because part of what we saw today at the press conference and yesterday is that they put winds in our sails, that we don't have microphones and fancy stages, but our voices are louder. Okay. And ultimately, we stand on the side of justice, freedom, and truth, and we're going to win.
That's right.
Thank you.
So briefly, what we're going to do is we did want to open it up for some conversation around next steps. We understand that we want to strategize and organize as we move forward, right? You know, yesterday we had a fantastic mobilization to shut down something in the bill. Today was a wonderful press conference. Today we're having a town hall meeting and to go forward. But we want to make sure that we can galvanize the energy in this room so that folks kind of come away that, you know what, there are some next steps. We are moving forward. We have things to do. We have tasks. We have assignments. All right? That's what Mumia would want. Right? Right. And we just said to on that point, as you guys begin thinking, I've met a lot of people in my life. Celebrities, you name it, people of high influence, people of high power. When I had the opportunity to meet Mumia Dubois last month, I definitely shared Tony's sentiment, the Monteiro sentiment, because it was probably the most empowering experience in my entire life on the night. And it was something that I'll never forget, primarily because it shifted the way I looked at the world, but more importantly, the way I looked at myself. And the level of commitment that he's been able to maintain for almost as much time as I've been alive. And so to be able to be in that space, and you know, I'll make the joke, to have our dear brother Mumia Dubois, as I went to the vending machine and asked him for something to eat, he said, push it with on. You know, with arms. It's like the title of a book. Because it was just so fascinating, again, the humanity that comes out of him it's the person of Mumia Jamal, and then we have the concept. And for many of us, we know him as the concept. But to know the human being that he is, and right now, living and breathing, that was, fantastic to see in Christ. But what we want to do is we want to actually get into the conversation. If you have some questions, some thoughts, some concerns, some ideas, particularly around not only what Dr. Monteiro mentioned in regards to our tradition, but ultimately how can we strategize this campaign to move forward over the course of the next 6 months up to a year? What would that look like for us?
And ultimately, this is really about taking Philadelphia and Pennsylvania back. Yeah. So this is about organizing in the streets, taking the streets, block by block. So that's really the kind of conversation that we want to engender this evening.
Yes. And real quick, I want to thank our folks from New York City that came up, from New York. Shout out to the folks from New York. Our brother Keith Cook in the house. Shout out to brother Keith Cook. But yeah, I do some hands in the back, so maybe if you get some conversation flowing around that.
Raise your hands high, please.
Okay, I sort of sit right here, let me go this way.
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick, with the same movement as Mumia, the silencing of prisoners,
yes.
The $6 are some prisoners that are being silenced.
Yes.
That will be silenced by the same act, as well as they I would be silenced because output. And so I just wanted to let people know about the $6 plan, that we really need to attack the court and follow them. We were passing on flyers about the $6 press conference on the $6 on Friday at the same place where we work today. And we're having a public event at the Tabernacle Church. But I think that's really important that people know about.
She was able to actually come out to our press conference this morning.
One of the things that I see that we've been doing is community that I keep going coordinator for the campaign for women and also.
That's right.
What we found out is that people will say, oh, well, I thought that background was dead, or I didn't know, I don't know who it is, or whatever. So it's very important that we do education. Yep. Education. The way we're doing it is we have what we call the theater on the street. Every Wednesday night, we initially Wednesday night, we show a documentary about whatever is perfect. For instance, we showed a documentary last week about the hidden story, the unknown story of the LA Black Panther. So we show very relevant movies and documentaries, educate people because people don't know what to do. So we need to do a critical mass. Remember that all the people we need to mass. In order to do that, we have to bring people up to where they need to be conscious. So, if anyone's interested, they let me know. We can take documentaries all over the city.
Actually, we've gotten a few emails proposing specifically this, to create here in Philadelphia a prisoners' free speech corner. And I think that needs to be a committee. A committee needs to form out of tonight that is going to organize a prisoners' free speech corner. Imam Jalil Al-Amin is in Pennsylvania. We need to amplify his voice in every corner of Philadelphia. So Shashina is in the back, and she's has information, and we are going to have a sign up for this prisoners
free speech corner activities here in Philadelphia. Where?
Cultural beacon. Sure.
That's where we gotta go.
Yeah,
That's important.
yeah. We realize that we got to be innovative and new, right? We got to be sophisticated and bring about new ideas for this process.
I'm gonna echo something Johanna said, we're in this room tonight to protect. And I want to call on everybody to go out to because that is the way, that's what the civil rights movement was not, the civil disobedience. It wasn't said, please give me. It was going out and taking. And I think that's what we have to do. Anyone who belongs to a news outlet, anyone who belongs to a church, a community, a union, student group, bring in Mumia's voice and play it. Bring in the other prisoners' voices and share it. And advertise that group. We don't assume anybody. Let's do it. Woo!
What we can do